Sand raked across his face with every gust, a fine, stinging spray that worked into his eyes, his nose, the corners of his mouth. Mauro Prosperi squinted into the wind, but the horizon had vanished. The Saharan sky was the same flat color as the ground. The race markers he had been following all morning were gone. Somewhere behind the curtain of blowing sand, hundreds of runners were still strung out along the course of the Marathon des Sables. Out here, in the middle of the storm, he could no longer hear them. All he could hear was the wind. He pulled his goggles tighter and bent his head, trying to pick out any sign of the track. The race rules said to stop and wait out a sandstorm, but instinct and training pushed him forward. He was a police officer from Sicily and a seasoned marathon runner. He had fought through pain before. This, he told himself, was only another kind of obstacle. Keep moving. Find the next checkpoint. It was April 1994 in southern Morocco. The Marathon des Sables forced runners to carry their own food and gear across more than 100 miles of desert, relying on organizers only for water and daily checkpoints. Prosperi had trained hard for it and was near the front when the storm rolled in. The air thickened, then the wall of sand hit. Visibility dropped to a few yards. Runners who followed the rulebook crouched with their backs to the wind and waited, letting the sand pile around them. Prosperi kept moving, aiming for where he thought the next checkpoint should be. Hours later, the storm eased. The sky cleared enough to show a pale sun hanging lower than he expected. Prosperi looked around and felt the first pull of unease. The track was not where it should have been. There were no footprints, no flags, no traces of other competitors. He was alone in an ocean of dunes and rock. He told himself he could still correct. The compass in his pack pointed north. If he walked into the wind that had been in his face, he reasoned, he would cut back toward the course. Every dune he climbed should have revealed something, a vehicle, a trail, a speck of color. Each time he reached the top, there was only more sand rippling out in every direction. As the day faded, he faced a decision that was no longer about placing in the race, but about survival. Night in the desert brings cold that bites as hard as daytime heat. He had a sleeping bag, a small stove, some food, and, most importantly, a limited supply of water. He dug himself a shallow trench on the lee side of a dune, crawled into his bag, and tried to keep his mind from racing. He had started with 9 liters of water and had already used part of it on the day's run. Now, cut off from the checkpoint system, there would be no refills unless he found people. The next morning, he set out again, using the sun to hold a line. Every hour, he measured out sips of water, letting them warm in his mouth before swallowing. Rocks and low bushes broke the monotony of the sand, but there were no roads, no power lines, no signs of life. At one point, he spotted goat droppings and felt a jolt of hope. Where goats lived, people did too. He followed the faint trail until the signs vanished into bare rock. By the 3rd day, the reality of his situation settled in. He was no longer a competitor. He was a man alone, somewhere in the Sahara, with shrinking supplies and no clear way to signal for help. He rationed more brutally, limiting himself to a few swallows of water and a small portion of food each day. His tongue felt thick and dry. His lips cracked and bled. When he urinated, he saved what he could, mixing it with water to stretch his supply. Then he spotted shapes on the horizon that did not shift with the dunes. As he drew closer, he realized they were walls, crumbling, half buried, but stone. It was an abandoned Islamic shrine, a small ruined marabout standing alone in the plain. He climbed inside through a broken opening and took stock. There was shade, a roof that broke the sun, and among the debris, signs of life. Bats clustered in the dark corners of the ceiling. Bird nests clung to ledges. In the silence of the ruin, he heard faint fluttering. He set up camp inside, arranging his gear and studying what food he had left. A few dates, some dried fruit, a handful of nuts. He knew it would not last. He had read stories of people in extreme conditions doing whatever it took. He was a vegetarian, but that boundary did not matter now. At night, he caught bats using makeshift snares and the small knife in his kit. Their bodies were tiny, but their blood and tissue offered both liquid and protein. He cooked what he could over a small flame and forced himself to chew and swallow. During the day, he tried to attract attention. He built a signal fire with whatever would burn, scraps of wood, dried droppings, bits of cloth. He lit it when he heard a distant engine or thought he saw a trail in the sky. Once, a helicopter appeared far off, buzzing low over the dunes. He waved, shouted, and fed everything he could into the flames to make the smoke thicker. The aircraft passed across the horizon and kept going. Search teams were looking for him, but the desert was wide and the ruin too small to stand out. As days passed, his body began to break down. He lost weight rapidly. The sun seemed to drill into his skull whenever he stepped outside. At one point, convinced he would not be found and unwilling to die slowly, he attempted to end his life. He cut his wrists and lay down, expecting his strength to ebb away. Dehydrated and with blood already thickened by days under the sun, the flow slowed and stopped. When he woke hours later, he was still alive. It did not solve his situation, but it settled one question. If he was going to die, it would not be by his own hand. On what would later be counted as around the 8th day since the storm, he decided staying at the ruin would only turn it into a tomb. He packed what remained of his gear, including an Italian flag he had carried during the race, and started walking again. His steps were shorter now, more like shuffles, but he kept moving, scanning the horizon for any line or shape that spoke of people instead of dunes. The ground slowly changed under his feet. Fine sand gave way to harder-packed soil. The wind carried different smells, still dry, but with a hint of something organic. In the distance, he saw what looked like a line of low trees or shrubs. As he drew closer, he heard a sound he had almost forgotten. Voices. He had crossed out of Morocco into Algeria without realizing it. The figures ahead were Tuareg herders and their families. When they noticed the gaunt, sunburned stranger stumbling toward them, wrapped in rags and carrying a crumpled flag, they approached cautiously. He tried to speak, but his throat barely cooperated. They understood enough. He needed water and help. They took him into their camp, gave him small amounts of liquid so his stomach would not seize, and later brought him to an Algerian military post. From there, word of his survival reached race organizers and, eventually, his family. Back in Europe, newspapers had already begun to write about the Italian runner who had disappeared into the desert and was presumed dead. Instead, he was airlifted to a hospital and treated for severe dehydration, organ damage, and extreme weight loss. Doctors estimated that he had lost more than half his body weight. The race he had entered for challenge and adventure had nearly killed him. Out alone in the dunes, with sand scraping at his eyes and his throat turning to dust, survival came down to stubborn movement, improvised food, and a refusal to stop trying even when he believed no one was coming. Mauro Prosperi would eventually return to running, including other desert races. The Sahara had taken from him and changed him, but it had not kept him. Thank you for listening to horrifying survival stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.